Hello and welcome to the Doubts Aloud podcast with me, your Christian host, John Nelson. I have hijacked the show and it's just going to be Christian propaganda for the rest of the show.
Oh,
dear. My mouth is being taped over.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm back now. Oh.
We're tied up.
Yeah, you can't do this to us, you know. The Christians are taking over the world.
Yeah, time for the atheist breakout.
Yeah,
Time for the atheist fight back.
John, it's just fantastic to have you with us.
Thanks
You're
for
our
having me back.
favorite guest, I think, because of we were your guests in your Oxford College.
Yeah, that was great. That was
amazing.
Christmas 2 years ago, I think.
Wow.
So yeah, that was a really lovely evening.
Yes, that's right. Gosh.
That was lovely.
So, but perhaps then, John, you can give us a bit of a background to why your background, basically, but also why you're here today and what we can sort of talk about.
Cool. Well, I'm a PK. I'm a pastor's kid. So I was raised actually in a New Frontiers church. I'm not sure if you know this about me, but a New Frontiers church, which is a kind of a strange mixture of Reformed theology with a kind of Pentecostal practice. So it's charismatic, sort of real emphasis on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, but alongside a kind of, a pretty high or conservative view of Scripture. I'm not sure if inerrancy was sort of taught from the pulpit. Well, actually, we didn't have a pulpit because we were meeting in a school. Yeah. It was, I would say quite a sort of conservative church. I went to a Bible camp when I was 13. And I think I was already sort of maybe age 10, 11, 12, experiencing some kind of existential angst, as a lot of people do around that age. I think I was one of these people who was always getting saved. So I was always praying. I was always praying the sinner's prayer. Yes.
Well, as a Calvinist?
Well, yeah, I don't think maybe at that age I sort of hadn't reconciled everything systematically in my head. So I was I think I was just seeking God, and I went to a Bible camp. I sort of got more interested. I sort of committed myself to Christ during one of the meetings, sort of went forward for a kind of altar call. And then actually one of the first books I read, sort of seeing myself as kind of early Christian, was actually Ken Ham. So it was an Answers in Genesis guidebook. And so sort of lapped that up. I actually, in school, I went to a Church of England school. And I remember being very surprised when the teacher told us that the world was, or we were comparing carbon dioxide levels over sort of millions of years. And I remember saying, but we're Christians, we don't believe the world is millions of years old. So that was kind of my kind of insular, sort of narrow perspective at the time. I remember she actually was very generous to me and let me teach a lesson on my own views about the origins of the world. So just loved theology. I think I became a sort of 5-point Calvinist. I wanted to study music and philosophy because I like playing the trumpet, and I was really interested in sort of big questions. Then I think I remember my dad coming into this room where I'm recording, and he had a little blue book in his hands, and it said, "On guard, defending your faith with reason and precision." And I remember that as a real turning point, actually, in my life, because it really just sort of showed me another side to Christianity. Sort of this could be a sort of evidence-based thing. I think previously it was very experiential. And I remember reading C.S. Lewis that summer, Timothy Keller, and a whole sort of range of people, and just being absolutely just sort of excited by the life of the mind. So I swapped to theology. I studied biblical studies at Nottingham, so I could really sort of get into the languages and the history and that kind of thing. And I think a lot of that was me trying to find a sure foundation for my faith. And then that sort of that became much more of an academic interest towards the end of Nottingham. Did a master's in New Testament at Oxford. And now I actually did a PGC afterwards. So teaching religious education. and now I'm doing a PhD. I didn't want to teach on
Wow.
COVID, so I've been a bit of a perpetual student. So, which my
And what's your PhD in, John?
So my PhD is in New Testament and Christian origins. It's with quite a famous Jesus historian, Pilate historian called Helen Bond. And she recently wrote a book called The First Biography of Jesus, where she says, let's read Mark as an ancient biography. And I had been writing on this in undergrad, in my master's. Helen actually came to Oxford, so she inspired me in that sense. Sort of got emailing and sort of applied to work with her. So I'm now actually based up in Edinburgh. And,
oh, wow. Lovely.
And
great.
cool city.
Yeah.
Doing a PhD. My working title is Christ's Physical Appearance, Biography, Christology, and Reception. So I've actually taken a bit of a turn away in sort of more recent years, away from kind of the historical Jesus, which was probably my primary interest, into actually, instead of getting behind the text, why don't we actually read the texts and see what they're doing and look at their genre and look at them as literature, which I'm finding sort of much more promising at the moment. So that's how I've sort of
that's brilliant.
Got here.
Great summary.
That's wonderful.
I do remember New Frontiers. My first realization about New Frontiers is I was in a church that couldn't work with them. Because we were solidly Arminian and also have women pastors. And so when I heard of New Frontiers, they looked just like us. They were a church in church halls, but there was this complete difference in sort of female leadership. And so it was one of the reasons we couldn't interact, or sort of, it was just that's my first memory of New Frontiers.
And that's often the thing that people will pick out, as the things to sort of criticize New Frontiers for. I mean, in that sense, they're quite like, Catholics or Orthodox.
Yes, very much so, actually. Yeah.
But I actually, during my time studying theology at Nottingham, I did a terrible thing. I apostatized and became an Anglican. Which I've sort of remained, or I'm now Episcopalian in Scotland. So that's kind of where I am. But that church really, I think, is fantastic because it's a broad church, and I was attracted to it because it gave me a space to think, and hold some heterodox opinions whilst being connected to this, rich Christian tradition. So that's kind of why I found my place in Anglicanism, and also being really attracted to sort of the liturgy, and just I think sometimes it's difficult. I think when I was a teenager, a lot of the emphasis is almost placed on you making your own decision, and I think some of the existential angst I was talking about is related to this heavy burden placed on the individual. And I realized that in Anglicanism, that's not really the case. I mean, a lot of my friends are Anglican, and they grew up and they had a relationship with God from a very young age. And they didn't seem to have this kind of like internal wrestle. Faith always came as something very natural. And actually, that's very kind of attractive to me. I don't think that people should sort of, I'm not judging anyone, including my parents, but I don't think people should bring up their children, if they're Christians, as kind of atheists until proven Christian, which is sometimes how it sort of felt to me. But yeah, I'm probably going on a rant now. So
that's great. Well, we came across you when you were still at Nottingham.
Yes.
Because you, in the holidays, you joined us in London with a discussion group, and you were absolutely tremendous. Oh. And I remember you being you kind of really knew your stuff, but and you were arguing for it, but you had that sort of sense of openness that was just wonderful to interact with.
Oh, thank you.
My memory is stronger than that, though, for John, because I think you came along to one of the ones, possibly when some of the Oxford people were coming up. I think Josh, and there was a bunch from Oxford people coming up, and I'm sure you were there on one of the nights, John, separately. But my memory distinctly was that I had never met, to use the term, the professing Christian, who actually, I'd read it, so I knew there were Christians out there, but I'd never met a physical human right in front of me who could have Christian faith without a literal Adam and Eve. And so I went home totally shocked because I was, trying to talk to you to say, how do you work it with an Adam and Eve and evolution? And you were going, well, Adam and Eve, I don't think I have to be a literal. Whoa, what a shock for me. That was like, wow. So you are the first actual person that I've met.
And I think, I'm very sort of, to the extent that I am I am an apologist, which is not very much. But I think what I want to do, just in conversations with people about faith, and maybe we'll get on to this in relation to either the resurrection or the virgin birth, is to say, well, the thing is, these things are difficult to believe. And I think we can have a broad church. And I don't think you necessarily have to take everything literally in the Gospels to have a faith. And I think, we're living in a post-hume world. It is very difficult to assent, I think, intellectually, once you've thought about it, to everything in the Gospels as being a sort of historical fact. I just think the evidence is not really there for that. But what I want to say is that, you don't necessarily have to believe in a historical Adam and Eve, or a historical feeding of the 5,000, or a historical virgin birth to be a part of this Christian tradition, and to see great value and truth in it. So I think that's been one of my big kind of apologetic interests, if you can call it that.
Fair enough. But let me just stop that and put that on a loop. That's a great way to put it. Yeah.
I think people like Gerard Bias, who's been our guest as well, he would absolutely say that kind of thing.
Yeah. Peter Enns. There's probably more and more every day. Like that form of Christian. Yeah.
I mean, what for you, perhaps we can come back to this later, John, but what for you are the non-negotiable things?
Well, I think the non-negotiable things, I was about to say Christmas, but not even Christmas, incarnation. I think the mystery of the incarnation is absolutely pivotal to Christianity. I don't think you really have Christianity in any orthodox sense without incarnation, and also resurrection. And also, I think for me, it's still a supernaturalist faith in that, it's a hope. It's a real hope that God will one day restore everything, that there'll be almost a cosmic cleanup in which the world is put to right through Christ in some way, without sort of being sort of overly specific about, my eschatology. But I think those are the sort of non-negotiables, and also forgiveness of sins. So not necessarily a particular model, you could be Christus Victor, or, paying of debts, or
penal substitution.
But in some sense that Christ's death is a sacrifice for sin, is the way in which God is reconciling the world to himself. And I'd say that's pretty much it. I'd say Apostles' Creed, something like the Apostles' Creed would be it for me.
The Apostles' Creed has got the virgin birth in it, which is.
I should say I would be construing the virgin birth in a particular way there.
Oh, okay.
So I would, I would. I'd agree with the sense of virgin birth, but maybe not necessarily as a kind of literal historical miracle.
This is where we come into language as well, though, because I know that there's other sort of very progressive Christians that would you can agree totally across the board on the language, like resurrection, but not necessarily the resurrection in the same way that someone else sees it. So, and that's probably what you're very familiar with, and I'm just trying to think now of who that person is down in Oxford who's very liberal Christian, who does believe in the resurrection and everything you just said, but doesn't think it's the actual three-dimensional body kind of resurrection, as most of Christianity went that way. But I forget his name now. It'll come to me. Yep. But anyway, yeah.
So going back a bit, when we knew you at Nottingham, you were still much more at thinking that a lot of this physically happened in a way that we can be reasonably confident about in the Gospels.
Yeah, I think so. I think I hadn't necessarily thought about everything in a great sort of deal of depth. I think the thing is, you can do a biblical studies degree, but what are you doing as part of that? You might do a bit of Greek, a bit of Hebrew, maybe a theology of Paul module. It's not, you never get to really, deep dive into one particular issue. Well, maybe for your thesis. But, and even kind of like now doing a PhD, it just feels like every day I go on with this, the less I know, because I just have more questions and I just don't feel like I have the resources to answer them very effectively. So a lot of what's happening, I think, in scholarship sometimes on these kind of introductory issues is that, a lot of people will just, maybe even scholars will just repeat what they've heard or what they learned, maybe it was back in the 80s or, whenever. And that will just become, almost like the dogma for them. And they won't necessarily question it. So I don't know, maybe the existence of Q would be a good example of this, where Q is a kind of working hypothesis and people work with it. But a lot of people would say believe in Q, but they've never studied it in any depth. It's just something that everyone's talking about. So they might, in their thesis start talking about Q as well, but not be a Q scholar. It's just something they work with. And then that reinforces this idea that Q actually exists. So that's just, just an example.
So what was the key thing you interacted with that made you adjust on the Gospels?
I don't think it's sort of, one knockdown thing. I think it's lots of little things. Because I think once you start negotiating here and there, so I read a book. This is actually later. I think this was in between my undergrad and my master's, called, I think it was The Theological Jesus and the Historical Christ, by Dale-Alison. And one of the things I really liked in this book is that he starts talking about the temptation stories. Okay. And in Mark, it's a smaller temptation story. And then in Matthew and Luke, because he just goes into the wilderness, but he doesn't have this sort of great dialogue. And then in Matthew and Luke, I'm not sure if they're sharing a source there or what's going on, but Matthew and Luke have a kind of dialogue with Satan, or Jesus has a dialogue with Satan. And what he says is that, this kind of mode or subgenre is also found in rabbinic literature. Where sort of, a rabbi will have a dialogue with Satan. And I just thought it's that kind of principle, which is, if I found this in a text outside of the Gospels, what would I make of it? I think that's the key historical principle that Dale-Alison is applying so much, and historians, generally use when they're looking at the Gospels. And I would say, maybe conservative historians would look at it less because they're usually trying to emphasize difference. But I don't think you can wave all of them away. I don't think you can wave all of these parallels away. I think you've got to work with these parallels. So if I saw that dialogue of the rabbis talking to Satan, I would think, oh, well, this is didactic. This is trying to teach us something. And then something that Dale-Alison does is, he looks at the Gospels as memories. So that temptation narrative is a memory of Jesus. It's going around, whether it's a false memory or a real memory or whatever. But what I realized is that memory can contain something true, even true about the historical Jesus, without being literally true. Because what happens is that Jesus is promised all of these things by Satan. So one of the things he's promised is worldly fame. And that didn't happen for Jesus. I mean, historically, that just did not occur. He was never a Messiah. And all of the evidence seems to suggest he kind of resisted that. He went to his death, perhaps even willingly. So there is a truth that's embodied in that memory, if you like. There's a truth that's embodied in that story, even though the story is not literally historically true. And so I feel like Dale-Alison gave me a way as a kind of thinking Christian to accept the authority and truth of this, accept the truth about the character of Jesus without necessarily saying this is literally historically true. And just on the issue of biography in general, it seems like what biographers were looking for is anecdotes about the character which express something true about the character. And so it might not always be kind of historically true, but it nonetheless expresses something which is true. Just as, when we all die, people, cheery thought, people are going to tell stories about us. They're going to tell anecdotes about us. And given what we know about memory, those anecdotes are not always going to be correct. But they're going to be remembered because there's something about them which captures something about Ed or Andy or Francis or John. So, and I think it's probably the same sort of thing going on in the Gospels, where we may not have sort of entirely accurate memories. Lots of things have gone on in that 40 to, however many years that after the events that the Gospels were written. Lots of things have gone on in the process of memory, and yet they still capture a gist. They still capture something about Jesus.
People say that about George Washington and the cherry tree. If you know that actually, there's apparently, Americans are far more obviously aware of that story. I think it's like, does anyone know the actual stories with the George?
It's that his father came home and saw that somebody had cut down the cherry tree. It was apparently sort of quite something and quite important. And said, who cut down the cherry tree? And George Washington, who was a little boy, stepped forward and said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I did it." So, just emphasizing how honest he was. But the story was completely made up by somebody who, I can't remember who the chap was who wrote this biography. But it was, like you were saying, it expressed an important thing about who Americans saw themselves as, who they saw as the values that they committed to, and who they wanted their first president to be, and what he was supposed to embody. So it was that sort of sense of, I suppose some might say, telling a greater truth through the use of a fictional account.
Which is quite similar to what you were saying. That maybe there's some things fully like that in the New Testament, or some things with a gist, but a lot of it made up.
If you look at, say, biographies or early biographies of Socrates, or biographical literature about Socrates, defenses, memoirs, and these kinds of things, they can't all be the historical Socrates. You could try to harmonize it all and say that Socrates just, changed his views later on in life or whatever it was. But actually, I think it's just that sort of in biographical literature, you would sometimes use your subject as a kind of mouthpiece for your own ideas, almost in homage to your leader, because they have set this stream of thinking and reflection in motion. And I would say that sort of a similar thing might be going on, say, with the Synoptics and John, where John's Jesus does seem to be a kind of a mouthpiece for those Johannine Christians or whoever they were, or the author of the gospel. It doesn't mean that there's no connection to the Jesus of history, but I just don't think that ancient people had the same kind of level of historical concern that we do. And I think that was also a realization as well. I think this is why genre is so important, and can be so important for Christians to understand as well, in terms of how literally they take the text.
Yeah, on that, I've got a question. We often hear about the Gospels as being compared to Greco-Roman biography. But is there such thing as Jewish biography? Is there anything in that we can compare, or is it just like Elisha and Elijah stories in the Old Testament? Is that the only?
Yeah, so you've got these kind of cycles. There is no discrete Jewish biography in the Old Testament. Sort of everyone agrees on that. There's one person who's tried to find biography in the Old Testament recently, a PhD student at St. Andrews. And I'm sort of arguing with my thesis that he's wrong. So maybe if my thesis is ever published, maybe you can consult my chapter. But basically, I think that there is no Old Testament biography. There is Jewish biography. And there's Philo. He writes 3 lives, and one of them really looks like a true Greco-Roman life, which is his life of Moses. He even sets out in his preface, and he says, "I'm about to write a life of Moses," so a bios.
Yeah, and he wrote in Greek, didn't he?
And he wrote in Greek.
So he was sort of taking on the genre of Greco-Roman biography to redo Moses.
Yes, but this is where it gets interesting, I think, because I kind of, in my thesis, I'm distinguishing between two types of ways a Jewish author could engage a Greek genre. So Philo's way of doing things is what I call assimilating biography. So, Philo is part of this slither of society where he knows this rise in biography and he thinks he can exploit it because, I can present Moses as this great Greek hero, but he's Jewish. And so he adheres to all the conventions of biography. So he tells us about Moses' physical appearance, and he includes this lovely preface. And so he's got Greek concerns in mind, and he writes it very much like a Greek biographer. I think what Mark was doing was much more what I call indigenizing. So because genres often blend in antiquity, I think he is, as they do today, I think he is blending the Greek genre of biography with Old Testament or biblical narrative types. This is why, for example, he doesn't sort of discuss his sources. He is this omniscient narrator who has access to sort of Jesus' heart, and that's his style of telling history. So I think we need to get away from the idea that the Gospels are Plutarch, are Suetonius, are Nepos and Digenes Laertius, these kind of like really sort of historical to varying degrees biographers. I think they're doing biography, yes, but they're doing it much more in a kind of, their own native fashion, which is much more Jewish. And that makes some things difficult because Greek and Roman biographers discuss their sources, for example. But apart from Luke's little preface, which is a kind of little, I think a kind of a trope really, that sort of makes it more historical, we don't have anything like that in the Gospels. So, actually John might have something, but, there's not a lot there, especially in Mark. And I think partly what was going on, in terms of, talking about Christmas, is that Matthew and Luke have looked at Mark's biography and they've gone, okay, this is clearly a biography in a broad sense. It's a narrative about a single individual, but it lacks some of the things that we want to see in a Greco-Roman biography. So it lacks a story of Jesus' infancy. So they both include these childhood stories and genealogies, and these are the sort of typical things you find in a biographical preface. So yeah, they've looked at Mark and wanted to sort of spruce it up a bit.
Yeah.
What you just said earlier will obviously be at loggerheads to a lot of other Christian approaches to, particularly the Gospels and the historicity of the events specifically. So this is probably a good time to mention one of our previous episodes and previous guests to bring out a specific example which you know a lot about, and I did a lot of research on, and that was the episode which I'm not sure what number it is. Ed, you might know.
I will let you know.
Yes, and it's Jonathan McClatchy, and that we had him on to talk about this particular form of apologetic, I suppose, which is called undesigned coincidences. And in essence, it was basically almost an argument to try and validate the historicity of events by each book giving something away, as you well know, knowing this subject, giving something away in almost innocently, which then corroborated the other story. My research on it was immediately problematic with lots and lots and lots of questions and things about it. But when we had him on, we talked about specifically wanted to hone in and do something different than Jonathan normally does, which is really keep to the one undesigned coincidence as much as we can, not just sort of reel them off like bullets and then not think about them. And so you heard that episode, I gather. And
this is number 29.
Number 29. Okay. And so the essence there, as a particular example of wanting to defend historicity, was using arguments between the Gospels to show that the feeding of 5,000 really did happen, and therefore these differences give things away to show that it must have been independent memory that corroborated the other's memory, rather than touching into the whole idea of a genre, people copying Mark, people maybe looking at Mark, changing Mark, maybe having a theology that wanted to say something different than Mark, all of that was set aside to try and prove its historicity. So what would be some of your comments on that particular episode and that particular event of the 5,000 feeding?
I think, well, one of the things I think, I think if, say, a classicist or, an ancient historian looked at that story, they would go, oh my goodness, this seems to be a retelling of the story about Elisha in, I think it's 2 Kings 4, where Elisha feeds 100 people with 5 loaves. So immediately we have a sort of a direct sort of literary parallel to the feeding of the 5,000. So I think that should raise some alarm bells, just sort of historically speaking, because do we have a kind of intention to update a story here? I don't know. I think you have to just believe in. I don't think you can establish this historically, because I think you have to. I think the kind of almost the prior probability of something like this happening would be incredibly low, and I think much lower than something like healing miracles, for example, which are, you read, say, Craig Keener's book on healing miracles, and people are claiming to be healed all the time. So I think, and also with exorcisms as well. So I think a historian looking at, say, the healing miracles and the exorcisms will go, hey, it looks like this is something that someone in the ancient world could have believed was going on all the time. And it looks like, yeah, Jesus could have believed that he was a healer and an exorcist, and maybe he actually was. I mean, we can't really tell, but those kinds of miracles are quite well attested, kind of prior to the Gospels, and also in our sort of own modern experience. So applying a kind of law of analogy, I would just sort of say with my historical hat on that it looks like that's quite plausible. But I think with the nature miracles, you do have something quite different. So this is when sort of Jesus is walking on water, or the feeding of the 5,000, these huge nature miracles. These are, I mean, I actually found a few examples of these in the modern world, the sort of few testimonies of these, but these aren't sort of incredibly well attested. So I think kind of thinking about this historically, I think it's kind of quite a low probability that this kind of thing would actually occur. But then you've got on top of this, the idea that actually there is already a literary parallel. So I'm approaching this by saying we've got such a firm literary parallel, and we've got about at least around a 40-year distance between the alleged events and the first narration of this story. So I think that should sort of instantly give you a sort of a degree of caution in what kind of historical judgments you can make. I know that's not sort of specifically about the kind of the undesigned coincidences, but sort of just the general setup of the history. I think that's some of the considerations I would sort of bring in if I was thinking about this historically. On the undesigned coincidences element of it, I can't remember everything I wrote. I wrote a blog about this, and I think, I'm not sure if the blog is still around, but I wrote a blog, and I think
you were Carrier's hero
that Richard Carrier cited on his blog, yeah. And so some of them, it just looks like that it can be explained by the Gospel's own literary interests. So an example of this is the correlation of the timing. So Mark says that many were coming and going at this time, and in John's Gospel it says it was the Passover, or it was near the time of the Passover. So you could say, well, this is an undesigned coincidence, or you could just say, well, Mark has, and he actually does have, I mean, literally he says many were coming and going already in his Gospel. Mark just has lots of people following around Jesus all the time. So it's not really surprising at all that we should find him mention that many were coming and going. I mean, surely the many were coming and going is a setup for the feeding of the 5,000 in the first place. So it's kind of explained by the logic of the narrative itself. I don't think it's quite difficult to sort of use it in this way.
The one that I remember that I actually found quite impressive when I can't remember the first time I heard it, but it might have been Jonathan McClatchy. It was on one of the Unbelievable conferences. Somebody talked about it. And this was the person who was asked to tell them where we can go and buy bread.
Yeah.
And that it was that then there's another gospel that says that person was local to the area. Do you remember that one?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's Philip, and that came up in that episode, but I didn't think much of it at all, though, Francis. That one, but okay, yeah, John.
So I mean,
what can I say? I'm easily impressed.
Yeah.
No. I think that is very impressive. I think that is very impressive. I think the thing is, though, it's only impressive, I think, if you have Luke's account in mind, because Mark doesn't set it in Bethsaida. Luke has it in Bethsaida. So you've already got to be saying that sort of like you've already got to be following Luke's account. And now you could say that Luke actually was correcting Mark's chronology here. And that Luke had it right, in which case it is quite interesting that he goes to Philip and sort of asks him where to get bread. But I think it's Mark Goodacre who has an article on how sort of it looks like Luke has almost been fatigued in this, and he's copying Mark and sort of like forgets almost like the location, as it were. And I think there are sort of examples of this in other literature as well. So I don't think this is that surprising.
I mean, that's why I wasn't impressed with it, because if you go with Mark Goodacre's idea that not just his, but the idea obviously that Luke was copying Mark or even rewriting it. He does seem to talk about a desert place which is not in Bethsaida, and then suddenly Luke had already set it in the town or village of Bethsaida. Yeah. And already, whilst using an undesigned coincidences to talk about the historicity, you've got to get over the hurdles you've talked about, which is, hang around, was Mark wrong then? So Luke's correcting something. Luke is also fatiguing before we get to the undesigned coincidence, which is meant to be showing that it all happened. And it's like, well, you got to get through fatigue and correction first, but also, as you said,
Yeah, but also because you only have that asking of Philip, in John. Mm. Well, could it not have been that sort of Philip's memory, like that John has preserved a genuine historical memory, that Philip is from Bethsaida, and that that John, who knows Luke, potentially, by the way, because I think there is now a wave of scholars who are saying that John at least knew Mark and possibly knew some of the other Gospels. And in fact, I think that's what Jonathan himself thinks, that John was dependent upon the other Gospels. So why couldn't he have preserved that genuine historical memory and included it as a little tidbit in his Gospel? And therefore, in this event, which he believes is set in Bethsaida, have included naturally a conversation with Philip, because not everything is necessarily going to be included in the text. I mean, it might have been known by the audience that there was a memory of this thing occurring in Bethsaida, and that John didn't have to sort of explain this when he was narrating the feeding of the 5,000. So I think in terms of the methodology, it's very interesting that Lydia McGrew starts that book with a kind of almost like a court case analogy. And this is just so typical. I mean, it's so funny how John Henry Newman did not like William Paley, who came up with this, because he said it's like you're putting the evidence of the Gospels on into a law court. And, John Henry Newman, incredible classicist, ended up a Catholic priest, scholar, and he realizes that you can't do this with the Gospels. And he actually talks about how Paley's undesigned coincidences just don't really work, which is very interesting. But she sets up this scenario where I think sort of, I can't remember the exact thing, but two people are having coffee. One of them spills a coffee on the other one. And then another person relates that it was busy in the coffee shop that day, which kind of explains why they spilt it, or something like this. But none of that is what we've got going on in the Gospels. In the Gospels, we've got texts which are literally dependent upon one another. At least Matthew and Luke are depending on Mark. John might be depending on Mark, possibly Luke, maybe Matthew. So it's, and also we know that these texts were circulating, because by the time that Luke is written, whenever it was written, he's saying that many accounts had gone before him. So we know that there's a lot of literary dependence. It's just not the same sort of situation.
I said that to Jonathan McClatchy when he came to our meeting and talked about this. I said that you need to talk. I told him afterwards, you need to tell the audience something that you're not telling them. And that is William Paley was doing this without the knowledge that we have of greater knowledge at the very beginning. He didn't know about this severe literary dependence and these songs. It was almost going in, it seems to me, because he was 17th century, 17 something, wasn't it? As 18th century, I can't remember now. With Paley's original thing. Someone called Blunt took it on. But that was prior to the what you call the synoptic development and studies, or at least at the beginning of it. And so I felt that was really unfair to say, when William Paley was sitting, say he came to our meeting in his mindset, he would be innocent of all of the stuff we've discovered. Yeah. Whereas Jonathan isn't. He's just like not mentioning it. We'll clear the shelf of all of the last 200 years, and we will now start with interlocking the Gospels as literal events, like 2 videos, and I felt that was where he was wrong, that he should be telling people, oh, they all knew each other. Oh yeah, they might have shaped it this way. Oh, John might have wanted to put words in the mouth of Jesus here. But by the way, everything literally happened. I don't think you can do both, So anyway, but just an example.
I've just been reminded of another one, another kind of undesigned coincidence that was raised in relation to the feeding, where you sort of have this green grass in Mark, which also seems to tap into John's placing of it around the Passover, because Passover would fall in the month of Nisan, so March, April, which is in Israel. If you've been to Israel, there's not a lot of green grass there, so it would fall around that time. But the thing is, you can often find some kind of literary intention as well, because that is a heavily messianic episode there. I mean, people are awaiting a prophet like Moses. It's set up in such a way that sort of Jesus has compassion for the crowds. He goes up a mountain. All of this is strongly Mosaic typology. And he's also teaching the crowds. So you have in, I think it's in Ezekiel, this stress on green grass, where I think green grass actually occurs like 3 or 4 times, and it's describing the Messianic age. So I think this is just an example where it just fits perfectly with the kind of characterization that the Gospels, or at least the Gospel of Mark, is already trying to present Jesus as. So that's just another way where we can already explain it on the literary interests of the Gospels themselves. So why do we also need to sort of speculate about the history, which was, say, 40 to 80, 90 years before? I think it's just very difficult. I think what we can say with greater certainty is what the Gospels were trying to do rather than sort of scraping behind the text so much. And I think so. You can also, I think, when you think about memory, collective memory, it's also, I don't think it's very difficult to get this kind of story arising and then being sort of like concretized in this literary tradition, because Jesus presumably was eating meals with his disciples all the time. At least we have other traditions where, that's one of the things Jesus is remembered for, eating with people in a distinctive way, a way that other Jews weren't eating with people. And so I imagine that Jesus was having meals with his disciples. I also imagine, and this is basically purely on historical knowledge, that Jesus was also healing people, exercising, essentially doing things like what Elisha was doing, like what Elijah and Elisha were doing. And as soon as you have that, Jesus is an Elisha figure. And that's the kind of collective memory of Jesus that we have. Jesus is this sort of person. Then I think Jesus eating with his disciples, Jesus teaching his disciples in open spaces, because presumably Jesus was quite popular. Maybe not quite as popular as 5,000 people, because where did they all come from? I think archaeologists would tell us that, there probably weren't actually enough people in all of the surrounding areas to get 5,000 men, let alone women and children. So I think that's interesting in and of itself. But I think as soon as this memory of Jesus as this type of figure who would do these sorts of things is firmly solid, and we have reason to believe that it would have been, then other typological connections arise even when they didn't occur. So I think that's why I'm so cautious about saying that this was definitely a historical event.
Well, and the feeding of the 4,000 must come into it, because I mean, how dumb do you want to make the disciples? I mean, I know Mark has a theme of that, making the disciples really dumb, and that seems to be more literary, because could you really be a few weeks later and then he feeds the 4,000 and they say, how are we going to get food when they've just had the 5,000, when they've given food? Surely the disciples would be reported as saying, let's do it again. But they don't. They go, what can we do?
Can I come back to a term that you mentioned earlier? And I just wonder if this would be a good point, perhaps, to explain it for listeners who are not familiar with it. And that was the reference to fatigue. Because I think is that what fatigue means? I mean, I'm not a great scholar in this matter myself, but is that what you were referring to? That the gospel writers put something in twice because of scribal fatigue, and they sort of miss the fact that they've already covered this, and they sort of pick up their story in the wrong place. So is that what is meant by fatigue, or have I got that wrong?
It's something that Mark Goodacre came up with, and it's an extra layer of evidence that Matthew and Luke were copying Mark rather than vice versa.
Actually, it wasn't Mark who came up with it. He just sort of power packed it. It was somebody called Goulding. I don't know if you've heard, who used that. He didn't use the term. Mark came up with the term gospel fatigue. But maybe, John, you could explain, and this is why...
Well, we haven't explained what it is yet.
No, but maybe you could
explain
undesigned coincidence better than I did, and then go on to say there's now another approach at looking at how the gospel's interacting, just so that the listener can contrast these two very, very, I think they're very, very different ways of trying to interlock, see how the gospels are working with each other.
Yeah, so in explaining editorial fatigue, I think it's the notion not that, say, Mark would be doubling up a story because he's forgotten it as such. It would be say Luke is copying Mark, and maybe Luke is adding his own material in, and he's forgotten, or he is forgotten to sort of remain consistent with Mark's narrative. And so there's been some tension. Maybe his narrative ends up in the wrong place, for example, because this is just what's happening. It's very difficult when you're, say, using a text so heavily in a kind of literary way, when you're, say, copying out verbatim what they're doing, and then you're trying to craft in your own material, kind of narrative inconsistencies would arise. So I think that's the notion of fatigue. He's fatigued in the sense of he's kind of almost forgotten what he's doing, or he's forgotten to kind of make it all sort of consistent. But I'd say the notion of undesigned coincidence would be that there is a kind of casual interlocking of different accounts, as you would find in sort of court case testimony. So say if, we're all in a court case, and I think I've heard maybe one of the McGrews or maybe McClatchy use this example where you get some of the independent witnesses together, and they're in a bank robbery, and one of them says the man bashed his head. I think I saw the man bash his head, the robber, and fall over as he was on the way out of the building. And then someone else doesn't mention the fact that the man bashed his head, but they said, maybe they were inside the bank and they saw this man and they said, this man is really kind of humongously tall. And so that would be a kind of evidence where you've taken two people and they're both trying to identify this robber. And they've said things about this robber which kind of interlock in such a way that it kind of shows their testimony. They genuinely do seem to be talking about the same person. The person who probably bashed his head on the way out is probably also the person who was inside the bank as, humongously tall. But that's not the kind of thing that we've got going on in the Gospels, because the Gospels are actually writing way later, are depending upon each other for their accounts, and have their own interests, their own literary interests, their own literary themes that they're trying to bring out. And so sometimes undesigned coincidences are just that. They are coincidences that when we go looking for them in between the texts, we can find something that seems coincidental. But actually, when you consider that coincidence almost, or that element on its own within the course of a discrete narrative, it makes total sense as a kind of part of that narrative's literary kind of like artistry.
But
So
what
I
I
think
what I can do, that's very, very good. What I can do is I'm going to try and use that analogy that you gave and now apply it to this other thing that Francis was talking about called the gospel fatigue, not undesigned coincidence, two different things. And the way to do that analogy of the bank would be somebody taking the testimony of that event of the bank robber, not actually being there. They take that testimony, but they know that the main road to get away from the robbery or whatever is out the back, not the front. So they set it and they say the car was waiting out the back. But as they're writing down the testimony, they forget that they've done that. And they say, and as they all came out the front, and they've forgotten. So somebody picks up and go, hang around, you've just established it was at the back. And now you've got them all coming out the front because he's going back to the testimony where they did come out the front, but he's relocated it. And so that's a totally different way of using that analogy with two different ways. But what you're saying is the Gospels are more like, Gospels are more like that. They're taking someone's story and maybe there was a way that Luke said, well, no, the feeding of 5,000 must be in the town, really. It can't be out in the desert like Mark had it. But then he forgets and he puts it, go into all the surrounding towns because we're in a desert place. What? You're in a town already. So that's the difference in gospel fatigue and as opposed to undesigned coincidence. So there you go.
Yeah. Okay. Can I it's our Christmas episode. We've done a bit on the birth narratives. And we covered this a couple of years ago in our Christmas episode. And I would like to sort of test out my very layman's take on things with a professional expert that we have for free with us. And I start with something which I can't remember. I think I got it just by looking at a table. And that is that when you compare the three synoptic gospels, you have a massive narrative blocks in Mark, and Matthew and Luke add a lot of material, but they hardly add narrative. They add extra bits to say Jesus walking on water. Matthew adds Peter walking on water, but he doesn't have a whole new block of text of narrative, except in one instance, which I'm aware of, and that is the story of Peter finding a coin in a fish's mouth. And I think the whole of the rest of Luke and Matthew's use of Mark, from the start of Mark's account with John the Baptist through to the empty tomb, the narrative blocks are all taken by Luke and Matthew from Mark, with this one exception of the coin and the fish. So that to me is a really telling point, which I'm not sure I've heard discussed much.
Yeah, I think I don't really know what to make of it. I mean, I can't think of many narrative incidents that Matthew and Luke do add in. So I wouldn't be sort of surprised if that is the case. They seem to, maybe you could almost say that they're taking Mark in the direction of a more philosophical biography, because we do have biographies which are almost entirely just like the pithy, the kind of witty sayings or the stories of a figure. We've got the life of Aesop, and Aesop is always telling fables. Lucian in the 2nd century, and he's a kind of satirical biographer, and he writes a biography of Demonax, and that's almost entirely composed of sayings. So I think you can imagine how sort of Matthew and Luke have seen Mark, and they want to add a bit of narrative in that they have to, which is to make it look more like a biography, which is the infancy narratives, and they both have kind of childhood stories. But
yeah, so this is my second point leading on from that.
Oh, yeah.
And that is that the appearances in the end of the Gospels and the narratives at the beginning of the Gospels are completely distinct, in that Matthew and Luke are irreconcilable. Well, they're completely different stories. I don't want to be all counter-apologetic about it and sort of saying there's a coincidence. What I am saying is they are completely different stories. You get when Mark isn't a guide, and the narratives of the nativity is like that, and the appearance narratives are also like that.
Yeah, and I think that's very interesting. I don't exactly know what to make of it. I mean, some people would say that maybe sort of like Luke is polemicizing against Matthew or whatever, or maybe, I mean, and this is a kind of apologetic for the virgin birth. Maybe there is some kind of pre-existing tradition with relation to the virgin birth. Maybe there's already the idea before Matthew and Luke are written that Jesus was born of a virgin. And to be honest, that wouldn't kind of surprise me, given what we sort of, know about sort of Greco-Roman stories. And so maybe it is the case that at some point in between the writing of Mark, or maybe just Mark, had his own reasons for omitting something like that. But I think what they're trying to do almost is they're trying to, with the infancy narratives, push back the idea that Jesus is the Son of God all the way to his birth. So it's almost like, Paul says in Romans 1 that Jesus was declared Son of God, the resurrection in power. Okay, so it is a bit ambiguous, and I think Paul does believe actually that Jesus is a kind of pre-existent Son of God. But Mark kind of almost has Jesus as Son of God at his baptism. Whereas I think it would be very natural for Matthew and Luke to want to sort of push that back even further and say that, and express in a narrative form that Jesus was the Son of God for his whole life. And I think the way that they do that is very natural. And I think this is where, my great hero, C.S. Lewis, was probably mistaken, because he says that myth becomes fact. Okay. But he knows that ancient people love to tell myths. So why can't it be that sort of, yes, the myth did become fact in the sense of truth, transcendent truth really did become incarnate in the person of Jesus, that God did take on flesh. But that doesn't mean, and I think this is kind of way of thinking that maybe I used to have, and a lot of people have, which is if we have one miracle, say the resurrection, then that means that all of the other miracles just follow or are of the same evidential quality. And I think the virgin birth is a good example of how this is not the case. It's not there in Mark. As far as we know, Paul did not believe in the virgin birth. But I'm not going to say that Paul is not a Christian. He's a Jewish Christian. But so I just think, its absence, and then also its absence from John as well. We have the Logos taking flesh, and that's so pivotal to John. But John doesn't feel the need to have an infancy narrative. So I think that really shows that maybe what we have, it's very difficult to know whether when Matthew and Luke were telling those stories, whether they actually almost believed them literally. It's kind of, I just wish we could sort of interview them and say, what do you really think about this? It's so frustrating. But what I would say to the Christian is that the incarnation is different from the virgin birth. The virgin birth is a narrative which expresses in a way that any ancient reader would understand that God's father Jesus' father is God. And that means that Jesus is the Son of God. And a narrative way of expressing that is to say that, there was a virgin birth. And then there are omens and there are portents and there are all these other types of things that you would expect.
Happens in a lot of Roman stories, apparently. Yeah. So it's a Roman trope, isn't it?
Because when I read Suetonius's biographies, and he has all of these, it's almost like a trope that he includes these omens and portents, which sort of predict the Caesar's rise or predict the Caesar's death. I think that probably there were some traditions of these. And I think sometimes maybe those traditions were even based loosely on facts. But I don't take these as just historical, which is why sort of biography is not a shortcut for the apologist. The biographies, yes, it's a historical genre. Yes, mythicism is silly once you start considering the Gospels are biographies. But it's no shortcut to historicity either. And also we've got to consider that usually by the time that the biographer is writing, the subject's birth is usually the time where the subject hasn't become popular because of the way in which they were born. They've become popular because of what they did in their life. And then you have to sometimes really, imaginatively reflect on how they could have been born in a way that reflects the way they live their life. So I think it's almost like retroactive reasoning. It's okay, this person. So Plato, I think, ends up getting a kind of divine birth, because how could Plato not have a divine birth? Plato's words were like they were from God. So it's just natural that Plato should end up having a divine birth. And I think it's a similar case with Jesus.
But to go for one step further than that, I don't know if how much you're looking into already or will do the work of Robin Walsh, is it? And she was interviewed by Mark Goodacre, who seems to be pretty much raving about her work. She makes the claim, and I haven't read it, so I don't know, but she says that she was astounded by the amount of Roman tropes about empty tombs, that if you wanted to make a story about someone, a bit like you're just talking about in the other areas, of course Plato was divine. Augustus was divine, wasn't he? And some portents happened, and you think you're back to the very first thing that you said earlier on. When you go outside the Bible, what do you make of it? Well, of course he wasn't actually divine, and of course there weren't the portents, we would say, to Augustus. But when it comes to the Bible, of course the stars stopped across Bethlehem, and of course he did that. So that's the fun. To me, that's a fundamentalist leap. Whereas Robin Walsh was going into these empty tomb stories, not to say much copying from anybody, but it was just there in the way that they wrote, and she's much more arguing for more Roman influence, I think, in the Gospels than the swing has gone. That's what really was crucial to me, that the whole swing of scholarship had gone the Jewish way, because it hadn't been before much in the last 100 or so years, but now it seems to be like this might be a little pushback to a little more Roman influence, and some of these stories about empty tombs in the Roman way that Roman writers wrote are ways that you would describe someone who was important to say when they died, a bit like the reverse of a virgin birth. So I'm not surprised that there's tropes either end.
And I think, the Jewish thing, I think, is much more in terms of recovering the historical Jesus. And especially after the Holocaust, because, the Germans were so bad, they had sort of institutes at their universities, I believe, where they almost promoting an Aryan Jesus. And so after the Holocaust, I think everyone was very, very sensitive to the Jewishness of Jesus for the first time. And you had great Jewish scholars like Gazer Vermesh writing on the historical Jesus. And actually, this was seen as quite positive. And a lot of conservatives particularly like this, because then they say, okay, we can actually show quite a lot in the Gospels, because Jesus is doing lots of things that we expect a Jewish figure to do. We don't have to get this entirely distinctive figure. We can imagine that Jesus probably was doing things like other Jews in the time, but at the same time, yes, Jesus was in Galilee, which was, to a certain degree, Hellenized. But the Gospels are being written all over the Roman Empire, possibly. So they are also if you're making Gentile converts, you have to express yourself in a way that sort of appeals to a Greco-Roman mindset. I'm not trying to make, by the way, a kind of a strong binary between like the Jewish and the Greco-Roman, because you just can't do that. So the empty tomb stories, my supervisor in the first biography of Jesus, she says that, I think she sides with the view that this is a translation fable. So you have people going to the tombs of Romulus and Remus, for example, and then I think Plutarch narrates this, and then they're gone. And the idea is that anyone knows that the fact they're gone means that they've ascended into heaven. So it's almost a narrative way of saying Jesus is in heaven. And maybe these stories were so popular because there were other precedents to them in the form of these translation fables. Robin
Walsh basically says that same thing.
But I think, though, I think it's a bit too simplistic just to say, well, because this is in the form of a translation fable, therefore there is no historicity to it, because we do still have to explain how they came to resurrection belief in the first place if Jesus's body was in a tomb. So I think, there are still questions. Some people would say, oh, look, I found a literary trope, therefore there's nothing in here that's historical. And I think that's just, I think that Richard Carrier, to be frank, is a bit of a fundamentalist in this regard, sort of, he's paid a lot of attention to what the literary theorists are saying about the Gospels, and then has gone, well, it's all just literary. And there's nothing historical to it. And I think that's just as bad as the fundamentalist who says, well, it's all historical, and then misses all of the literary allusions to the Old Testament and the Roman world and this sort of thing.
So you presumably then you would have a absolutely reasonable criteria to or would you, because I'm going to assume you're not going to assume that Plato did have a divine birth, that there's something to it. And so your criteria would have to really come clear to say Plato, Augustus, and there's a load more apparently that did have divine births. Actually, not true. Didn't happen. If you had a video camera, there was nothing there. If you could video a divine birth, but with Jesus, it's different. So presumably your criteria would be different. But otherwise, it's all the same. It would be the same. Richard Carrier would be right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's coming on to sort of like my own personal sort of theological beliefs. I think sort of, when I'm thinking historically, I'm thinking, there is no difference here. I mean, I look at the story of Plato's divine birth, and I see it as an expression about something about his character. And I see the same way with the stories of the virgin birth with Jesus. But that doesn't mean I don't believe in the incarnation.
Right, I see.
The incarnation is a mystery of faith.
Yes.
Because the incarnation is saying, well, profession in the incarnation is somehow saying, yes, I believe that in some mysterious way, God was working through this, historical individual. So I think it's very different. I think
is that what you mean by the Christ of faith? I wonder if you could explain the difference between when people talk about the Christ of history and the Christ of faith.
Jesus of history,
sorry. Yeah.
Well, I think they're just trying to say there that sort of, maybe Jesus could never have predicted what he would have been made of. So they're trying to say that there's this mythical character called Christ, and this Christ has very little to do with the historical Jesus. And I'm not quite sure about that. I think there were all sorts of things that Jesus were doing, which showed his very, very elevated sense of his own authority and his own sort of role in God's plan. So I think that binary is a bit too strong. But yeah, obviously there is a difference between some of the theological things and also maybe what was going through Jesus' head when he was walking around in Galilee. Because if you really believe in that Jesus became a human being, he was a human being. He didn't know about dinosaurs or the laws of quantum mechanics. Because that's just outside of the way that a first century Jewish person would think, obviously. There is.
But if it's an incarnation, though, would that be true?
Well, I think.
But that's the thing. If you're saying the incarnation is one of the things that you can't move on, surely the Jesus walking around would know about quantum physics and everything else, for that matter. So where does the rubber hit the road in the literal here?
Well, to be honest, I'm not really a systematic theologian. So I would just defer to them on this and say, well, this is a problem for you to work out. And,
right, fair enough.
And just to say, well, look, in what we're saying is that in some specific sense,
right.
God is Jesus and Jesus is God.
Yeah.
So but that said, I think that some Christians can be Christians without necessarily having a very technical understanding. And I think in terms of what theology will do, or what's, studying the Bible will do with all of its sort of, multiple interpretations, is I think it does give, I'm not saying, I'm humble or claiming humility or anything, but, I think it does humble you in the sense of you realize, oh my goodness, I could be wrong on certain things. And so I think in terms of what sort of studying theology actually does is it gives you probably a greater level of ecumenism, because you realize that you can sort of band round the essential things and then work out the details later. And we shouldn't expect, I think, theology any more than we should expect physics to be a kind of an easy thing. I think there are probably very intelligent people out there who can reconcile the divine and human natures of Jesus. I'm just not one of those people. But I think I think that's what it's done for me, is it's just made me open to sort of maybe seeing Christians where I wouldn't see Christians before, in my kind of, tribalistic, young adolescent mindset.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely tremendous. I think we're probably getting near our kind of crunch time of having the show too long if we carry on. Did any questions? We don't want to lose his wonderful knowledge and background and everything we have without asking the key question you had. No.
Well, I
don't have any key questions, but you have been fantastic, John. I mean, I think you've, the way you've explained things and pretty much done all the work. I think. Yeah,
I'm wondering if you could.
But you did all the speaking, and we just had to sort of chip in every now and then you were taking it away. So you've been absolutely brilliant.
I wonder to end if you could just sum up, which might not be easy, but sum up quickly. But sum up the contrast between, say, someone like an apologist sort of fundamentalist approach and your approach to, say, just the gospel, because it's not just a matter of differing on I don't agree with that interpretation of this. It's a very, very different angle that you're coming from in your natural assumptions, even as a Christian, than someone else's natural assumptions. Could you sum up and contrast those assumptions so that anyone listening can sort of really see the difference?
Well, I think what the apologist does is the apologist has a foregone conclusion in their mind, and then they will try to make the data fit the conclusion. And I think, admittedly, I mean, we all do this to a certain extent because we all suffer from cognitive bias. So I don't want to say, the apologist is doing this necessarily, but I do think there is a point where the rubber hits the road. And, once you start reading these texts alongside other ancient texts, you start to realize that if these were humans writing these words, that maybe not, they didn't sort of mean to take everything in an entirely literal sense. So some people would say that I have a lower view of scripture, or I take scripture less seriously. But I would say, no, in studying scripture in its ancient contexts and seeing that these human beings were doing similar things with Jesus as to what sort of other Greco-Roman people were doing with other figures, other ancient figures, I think that I sort of lost my train of thought there, but I think that suggests that not everything in the Gospels can just be taken as a kind of literal historical fact. I don't know what else.
Yeah, that was basically. I suppose it was just like, I suppose you would have maybe have gone on to talk about the fact that obviously when they're copying the others, they may have their own themes to develop. And in John, I suppose you were hinting at earlier that it's a lot of, in one sense, even writing later beliefs and putting them on Jesus's mouth at a later time, but still having an echo of Jesus somehow, that sort of thing. But that was the thing, the contrast.
No, I think I would want to say that I do think it's very ironic how modernist fundamentalism is, in the sense that modernism or fundamentalism buys into the Enlightenment. It buys into the assumption that for something to be truthful, it has to be verifiable, or it has to be historically truthful. So it's a kind of equation of truth with facticity. But there are lots of things that we Christians believe which do not fall into this category. For example, Jesus died for my sins. That is not a claim that can be, you can call that lots of things. You can call that myth or metaphor or some deep sort of spiritual truth, but that's not something I can actually establish. So even if you go all the way and you sort of prove all of the little bits, you still can't prove the significance of it. And surely as Christians, that's the thing that actually really matters to us. But that's something that comes more personally, more experientially, I would say.
Yeah, so if you had a video of Jesus dying on the cross and then resurrecting, that still doesn't show you any meaning about what it meant at all.
No,
from the fact that you've
got some blue smoke of sin.
Yeah, that's right. It just means, the guy was dead and he's rising. He's now alive. Good. What does that mean?
Yeah. So
I see what you're saying there.
The meaning isn't obvious, and the meaning isn't supplied by the data, as it were.
Yes.
We have to supply the meaning. So, oh gosh, there's something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember what it is now. There's so much to say.
Yeah.
You'll have to come back.
Yes. Let's get some more,
please.
Second coming. Okay. Yes. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much, John, for being a lively guest, full of interesting, very fascinating and interesting stuff.
Yeah. Thanks
indeed. And so, brilliant. Yes. So I until next time, and we'll get back with what we're going to do. And so,
Merry Christmas to everyone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've been Andrew, your host.
I've been Francis.
I've been Ed.
I've been John.
Brilliant. Bye.